My name is Lorraine Edmo, and I am a member of the Shoshone-Bannock tribe of Idaho, and I am currently the Tribal Deputy Director in the U.S. Department of Justice's Office on Violence Against Women in Washington, D.C., and I've been in that position for a little over 10 years now. I started there in the fall of 2006. And I will be leaving there in January of 2017 to move back out west. But it's been a real interesting time working at OVW. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about my background. I was born in southeastern Idaho, and I was one of 11 children of my mom and dad. My parents, my dad was Kesley Edmo Sr., who was a member of the Shoshone-Bannock Tribal Business Committee for 32 years. And of those 32 years, he was chairman probably 15 to 16 out of the 32 years. And my mom is Maxine Racehorse Edmo. She's still alive. She's 87, and she lives at Fort Hall, Idaho. And she's still active. She still helps teach a Bannock language class on my reservation. So I come from a strong family. My paternal grandparents were Eugene Edmo and Emily Truchot Edmo. Eugene was a tribal court judge for our tribe for about 20 years, and he was a rancher. He was really active, and he lived to be about 80 years old. My grandmother Emily was really a strong worker. She married my grandfather, I think around 1918, and she's was part French Canadian, because her mother was Louise Truchot Fellers, who came down from British Columbia. So my ancestry is not only American Indian, but it's also French Canadian from way back. My great grandfather his name was Francois Truchot, and he came from near Paris, France. And on my dad's side, my great grandfather was Chief Eremo of the. He was a first cousin to Chief Washakie of the Eastern Shoshones. And he was also a guide, I guess. He helped guide the settlers in the early 1900s, late 1890s. And there's a town in Idaho named after him, Eremo, Idaho. That's named after my great-grandfather. So I come from a long line of leaders amongst my tribe, because on my mom's side, my great-grandfather was Chief Racehorse, and there's a famous hunting and fishing rights case that involved him and some of the other older men from the tribe. It was around 1905, I think, when it was decided. But Chief Racehorse had taken a group of men out to go hunting in their traditional hunting grounds, which was near what later became Yellowstone National Park over by Jackson. And so they went hunting over there on their usual hunting trip, and they were arrested and thrown in jail, in a territorial jail out there near Du Bois, Idaho. And so they based their ability to hunt on our traditional hunting lands, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. It was called Ward versus Racehorse, and it was unfortunately decided against the tribe, but it was one of the first landmark hunting cases that did go to the Supreme Court. And then my mom's family, her great grandfather was Captain Jim of the Weiser Shoshones, and he used to go back and forth between Fort Hall, Idaho, and the Camas Prairie over by Boise. So that was also our traditional gathering area over near Boise by Castle Rock. And to this day, a lot of our tribal members go back there every year to pay tribute to our ancestors there in Boise. And this last summer, I took my mother out there to go to the Boise Valley reunion, which involves about 5 or 6 different tribes that go back to Boise for the reunion to, pay tribute to their ancestors. And it's an event that's held at near the Castle Rock area around Boise, and it involved this year the Burns Paiute of Oregon, the Shoshone Paiute of Owyhee, Nevada, the Warm Springs, various bands of the Warm Springs tribe in Oregon, the Shoshone Bannock, and other tribes that may have gathered in the area in Boise in the 1800s. So my family has deep roots in the area in southeastern Idaho and western Idaho, and we're strong leaders for our tribe, and still remain strong. I mentioned that I come from a family of 11 children. I had 6 brothers and 4 sisters, and of the 6 brothers, one of my brothers, Blaine, is currently our tribal chairman, and he's been chairman at least 3 terms out of about the last 12 years that he's been on the council. So he's following in the footsteps of my dad. And I have a brother who's the tribal tarot director, Wesley, an older brother, Leo, who lives there in the tribal elder facility, brother Kesley, who lives in Albuquerque, and he still does consulting work for the Administration for Native Americans. And he was one of the first tribal members to graduate from the University of Idaho back in 1971. And he got his degree in animal science with a minor in business. And then I have a brother, Kevin, who passed away, and a brother Gary, who lives in Pocatello, and he worked for the tribe for probably 22 years at least. And then I have 2 sisters that are living now. Lorraine Edmo. She's editor of the Shoban News, a long-standing tribal paper that I founded. I started the Shoban News in 1970, right out of college. I graduated from the University of Montana in Missoula. And I graduated from there way back in 1970 and was the second Indian to get a degree in journalism. And my second major was political science. And then after I founded the paper, I published the paper with the tribe for a year, and then I decided to go back, and there was an opportunity to go to a graduate program for American Indians at Columbia University in New York. And so my dad was able to get sponsorship from a local TV station in Idaho, the KID TV in Idaho Falls. So in order to go, you had to get the TV station to pay your salary while you were in New York, and then pay for your travel. And so I applied for that in the summer of 1971 and got the opportunity to go to New York and study at Columbia University. And there I learned how to be a TV journalist and I went to school with about 33 other minority journalists. And it was a summer session, finished up in September, and then I worked for the news station in Idaho Falls for about 10 months, 12 months, and then I decided to move on. And the reason I decided to do that was because I thought I was being discriminated against by the TV station, because they were hiring hiring white guys and non-Indians to work at the station at a higher salary than I was being paid, but I was still expected to do the same amount of work. I had to write the evening newscast and then had to do a story every day. And the other males that were hired were given a couple $100 extra a month. So I decided to move on and went to work in Boise, Idaho. The 5 tribes in Idaho had organized the what was called the Idaho Intertribal Policy Board back in the early 70s, and my dad was one of the founders of that, along with the Nez Perce, Coeur d'Alene, the Kootenai tribe of North Idaho, and the Shoshone Paiute, and then our tribe, the Shoshone Bannock. So they organized the Idaho Intertribal Policy Board and got some funding for it. And my cousin Jack was the director at the time, back in 1972, I believe. And so he recruited me to go work with him to do all of the fundraising. And so I went to work with him, and my co-worker Benson Gibson, who later became chairman of the Shoshone Paiute tribe. So we organized a lot of resources for tribes in Idaho. We got funding for the DOL labor programs. It was called CETA, the Comprehensive Employment Training Program. We had a statewide program. We had a state substance abuse program. We started a tribal newspaper for the organization, and we raised private money for that. It was called the Native Gem, and we published about 4 issues of that, I think, and we got all private money to pay for that. So we worked there at the Idaho Intertribal Policy Board for around 3 years, 3.5 years. And then I decided to move on, and I thought at the time in 1976 that I would go to law school. So I applied for law school, the summer program in law for American Indians at UNM in Albuquerque. And I got accepted. I went for the summer, and then I decided not to go to law school. I decided instead to go look for work, and at the time the Native American Rights Fund in Boulder, Colorado was hiring for a technical writer, corporate secretary, somebody to do all of their development work. And so I applied for that position and got that position. So I worked in Boulder, Colorado for nearly 5 years as the first position was technical writer. And there I worked with 24 attorneys, tribal attorneys, and they did a lot of cases in protecting Native rights, but they had to be cases that would set precedent for all of the tribes. And so they did cases like prisoner rights issues, they did right-of-way issues in Nevada, they did the whole land claim settlement in Maine. So I worked with all of those attorneys who worked on those landmark cases in Boulder, and worked with John Echohawk, who was then a young deputy director at NARF, and worked with Tom Fredericks, who has his own law firm in Colorado. worked with Tom Tureen, who was the lead attorney for the Maine Indian Land Claim Settlement Act, and just a whole range of attorneys there, and a board of directors. I had to do all of the organizing of the board meetings. We had 13 board members from around the United States, and so I did the working with those board members. We had a couple of executive committee meetings a year, and then a main steering committee meeting in the fall and the spring. And then I had to draft all of the minutes for those meetings and also draft the annual report and did the newsletter while I was there at NARF. So I worked there up until the fall of 1980, I think it was. And at that time I was development officer for NARF because they decided to separate the technical writer position from straight fundraising, and so we the director and I created the development officer position, and I took that position. I served as development officer for I think the last year that I was at NARF, and we would do a lot of fundraising with corporations, foundations, federal government. We had a couple of contracts and grants, and it was I think that was the most really beneficial position that I had as far as learning about nonprofit management. So there I learned what nonprofits should be about, how they should be properly managed and be held accountable. We had to really respond to the needs of the funders whenever we did our reports, and so it was a really good learning experience working at NARF, and I really enjoyed working with all of the attorneys there and the other corporate officers that I worked with. But when I decided to leave, I left because I wanted to go back and pursue my graduate degree and then really work closer to tribes. And so I left in December of 1980 and moved to New Mexico. I moved around Christmas of 1980 and went to go to graduate school at UNM in Albuquerque. And I had gotten a fellowship from the Office of Indian Education, and that was the second time I got a fellowship. I had declined the first one in order to work, but then I decided I better move forward and get a graduate degree. So I moved down to Albuquerque in January of '81 and started my graduate program, and that's where I met my husband, Jerry Cordova, and he was going to law school at UNM and later worked at the state Indian Affairs Commission as deputy director for that position, for that office. And so we lived in Albuquerque, and I worked on my graduate degree for I think about a year and a half. I got my graduate degree in a master's in public administration from UNM, and then from there I searched for a job. My first position, I think, after graduate school was with the National Indian Youth Council, and that was working with Executive Director Jerry Wilkinson, who since passed away. But we worked on the first ever, it was a study of voting rights in the new 3rd Congressional District of New Mexico. And so I had to recruit interviewers, and we had to train them. I worked with representatives of the Field Foundation, I think. And so we conducted the first ever study of voting practices of American Indians in northern New Mexico. That was in the summer of, I think it was the summer of '82, summer and spring of '82. And so we produced a report on the voting practices, and that was right after the 3rd Congressional District was created, and Bill Richardson was elected congressman from that district. So that was an interesting project. And then from there, I applied for the position as executive director of the American Indian Scholarship Program because the longtime director, John Rayner, had stepped down and retired, and the office was in Taos, New Mexico. That's where it had been located, near his house. And so in the spring of 1984, the staff and I decided to move the office back to Albuquerque, where it had originally been. And so we moved back to Albuquerque, and we changed the name of the organization to the American Indian Graduate Center. And so that was a really good experience too, because I directed a staff of about 6 to 7 people, and we provided graduate scholarships to American Indians and Alaska Natives all over the country. They attended about 110 colleges and universities. And so our annual budget then was around $3 million, and we had to do a lot of private fundraising, as well as we had a contract with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So while I was at AIGC, I would say we funded, over that time, I was there for 9 years or more, we funded probably at least 3,000 graduate students. And our graduate scholarships then were pretty substantial. They were anywhere from $8,000 to $12,000 a year. And then I'm not sure how much they are now, but the Graduate Center is still there in Albuquerque. And I worked as director for 9 years. And then in 1992, I decided to move on. And at that time, there was a new administration in DC. The Clinton administration had just gotten elected. And so I talked things over with my husband, and we decided we would go ahead and move to DC to take positions there. So we did that. We had a major move across country that we paid for on our own. So we sold our house in Albuquerque, and my husband stayed behind for about 7 months. But my daughter and I moved we were in DC by ourselves for about 7 months, and she would go to work with me every day. She was only 3.5, so she had to catch the subway in with me and catch the bus and the subway, so she knew the route, how to get to work. So I worked at the Administration for Native Americans for 14 months, and then she went to the daycare below the building. They had a daycare in the building. And so I left there after only 14 months because it was at the time I thought it was too restrictive working for the federal government. So then later I went back to the government, but then in '93, the fall of '93, there was an opportunity to work for the National Indian Education Association, which is an organization, a membership organization of about 3,000 Indian educators. And the way that came about was because while I was at the Graduate Center, I was on the board for the National Indian Education Association. And one of the things we did at the Graduate Center was we bid on hosting the Albuquerque Convention for NIEA in '92. And so we put on probably the biggest convention in Albuquerque. We had about 3,200 Indian people there for the NIEA convention. And because of that, we raised a lot of revenue for the organization. For both NIEA and the Graduate Center got a cut, they got about $110,000 from that convention. And then NIEA got enough money to hire a director. And so in the fall of '93, I applied for the director position for of NIA, and I got the position, and then I took that position and moved the office from DC over to Virginia, because it had been operated out of a law firm in DC with one part-time person. But NIA was an old organization. It had been in existence since about 1970, but they didn't have enough money to hire staff, and so it was in '93 that we did get enough money to, have a full-time executive director and then a part-time assistant. So I moved the office over to Alexandria, Virginia, and I was there at NIA for about almost 6 years, 5.5 to 6 years. And at that time we put on, every year they put on a convention, so I worked with 5 different planning committees, and we had conventions in Tacoma, in Tucson, in Nashville, in Oklahoma City, and in Mobile, Alabama. So that was a real good experience too, because I got to meet American Indian and Alaska Native educators all over the country when we'd have these conventions, and then work with the local planning committees to make sure that they put on a good convention. So that work at NIA, one of the most significant things that happened was we worked on the first ever executive order on American Indian and Alaska Native education that impacted kindergarten through 12th grade students. And it was after another executive order had been signed by President Clinton that impacted the tribal colleges. But we wanted one that would address K through 12 education. And so I worked with Indian educators from from 33 Indian organizations to get this executive order done. And we worked on it for 4 years. We worked on it from 95 or 94. It started out as a comprehensive Indian education policy statement, and we perfected it with our board of directors and with all these other organizations. And then we worked with a working group of federal people at the Bureau of Indian Education and the Office of Indian Education at the Department of Education. And we got the first K through 12 executive order signed in August of '98. And that was a real big accomplishment at the time, because there hasn't been a major policy statement like that on Indian education since then. There was one that was kind of like a duplicate of what we developed when President Bush came in, but it didn't have as much impact as the one that we worked on originally. So that was one of the most significant things we did while I was there at NIA, and I worked with the National Advisory Council on Indian Education, with the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, with American Indian College Fund people, with all sorts of Indian educators to get that executive order done. So as a result of that executive order in '98, there had to be work done in the offices, in the federal offices, to implement the order. And so I was recruited by the Office of Indian Education at the Department of Education by David Bolio, who was the director then, to work on implementation of that order. And so in the spring of 1999, I went to work at the Office of Indian Education in the Department of Education and worked on implementation of the executive order. and that was all during the Clinton administration yet. And so we worked on implementation for a couple of years. It was, everybody's hope that that order would have been signed a couple years earlier so that we could work on it all during the administration, but that didn't happen. So we just had a couple of years to implement that order, and we had regional partnership forums throughout different regions of the country. We developed some policy statements on Indian education. There was a lot of excitement at the time about, trying to improve the education for American Indian and Alaska Native students. So that was one of the, key parts of my job, was implementation of that, and then working with the staff at OIE and staff of the Bureau of Indian Education over at BIA. So I worked at that until I think it was the spring of 2002. And at that time, in the spring of 2002, there was another opportunity that came up over at Interior. And I decided to go because there was a change in administrations, and there was no guarantee that the new Republican administration would carry out the executive order that we had passed, and so, or that we had signed by President Clinton. And so in 2002, I went over to the Department of Interior, and there I worked on implementation of an act to organize an Indian Education Foundation that would benefit the Bureau of Indian Affairs schools. And so we found out the name that it was chartered as was the wrong name. It wasn't researched. It wasn't, whoever drafted the law didn't make sure that there wasn't another organization out there with the same name. So we had to spend a whole year changing the name. And so our board of directors came up with the National Center for Excellence in American Indian Education. So I worked with a board to try to implement the work of that foundation. And that was a real difficult task because at the time, the whole purpose of that, the new foundation, was to try to raise money for the schools, for the BIA schools and tribal schools. But the federal government also has a responsibility to provide funding for them. And so it was like a catch-22 situation, sort of, where you are trying to raise money for the schools that are supposed to be funded by the federal government. But, I tried to move ahead and get that all organized, and we did. We got nonprofit status. I worked with a pro bono attorney from a big DC law firm, and he helped draft all of the articles, the nonprofit status, which we got from IRS. Got a board of directors that was appointed by the Secretary of Interior, and that's when Secretary Norton was in office, and so we worked with her. She swore in all of the board members, and so we met several times. We had about 6 to 8 different board meetings. And because my position was what was called a term appointment, it was only for 4 years. And so there was no guarantee that my position would last past 4 years. And so when the time for the expiration of my appointment came up in 2006, there was no thought to continue the position, and so my position was expired, and they wouldn't extend it. The Secretary of Interior at the time wouldn't extend it, and so I had to look for another position. But the foundation had been organized and had nonprofit status. It had a board, but and we appealed to the secretary to continue the work, but it just didn't happen. And so it just dropped. And so I had to search for another position, and so that's when I found the position advertised for OVW's Tribal Deputy Director, which had been created by the Violence Against Women Act of 2005. And it was as a result of American Indian and Alaska Native women advocates that law came into effect, Title IX of VAWA 2005. And so my position as Deputy Director is the only one that is spelled out in legislation in DOJ. There's only, there are other heads of departments that are named, like it'll name the head of the Office of Tribal Justice in the law, and like the head of different bureaus of DOJ, but mine is the only one that actually has all of the requirements, all of the expectations of the job in the law. So if you look at the Violence Against Women Act of 2005, you'll see all of the job duties of the Deputy Director for Tribal Affairs. So I've been there for 10 years now, and during that time worked for 5 different directors. And I supervise a staff of 4 program specialists and a program assistant, and we manage grants that serve over 200 tribes nationwide. And we have 4 grant programs. We have the Tribal Coalitions. We have the Grants to Tribal Governments program. We have the Tribal Sexual Assault Services program, and the new Special Domestic Violence Criminal Jurisdiction program. So with all of those grant programs, OVW serves or provides about $52 million in funding to Indian country. That also includes some grants from other OVW programs. So part of my job is to make sure that, you know, all of those grants are, that the provisions of VAWA are lived up to with regard to the tribes. And another major component of that is consultation. So that's another major aspect of the job, is putting on the annual tribal consultation with tribes. And so I've worked on that for 9 years now. We've had 11 consultations. I guess 10 years I've worked on it. So we just had one here in Palm Springs. It was the 11th annual Violence Against Women Act consultation. And in putting the consultation on, I've got to work with the contractor. We just switched contractors a couple of years ago because our previous contractor had outgrown the 8A program that they have to, that we have to hire under. And so we had a new contractor in 2015, so I had to work with them for the whole year to put on a consultation. So every week I meet with the contractor and to make sure that the consultation is in good order and that it's going to be successful. And then I also work with them to finalize the annual report from the consultation. So it's, you know, a big responsibility. And this year we also had our first ever Alaska Native listening session in Fairbanks. So I worked with the contractor to organize that and to hear the testimony, conduct the consultation, well, the listening session in Alaska, conduct the consultation every year for the last 5 years, I guess, because we used to hire a facilitator to help with facilitating, but I started facilitating about 5 years ago. So those are the major duties of my position at OVW, and you know, I guess the thing, a summary of many of the things that I've done over the last 46 years that I've been out of college. With the exception of 2 years getting my graduate degree, I've worked out of college now for 44 years. So I think it's really time to move on and do something different and have some younger Native women take over the work of the Office on Violence Against Women's commitment to Indian people. So I'm really hoping that we'll be able to get somebody new on board that really has a strong commitment to American Indian and Alaska Native people. But I would like to pay a lot of my, my strength and determination to work for Indian people to my mom, Maxine, and my dad, Kesley. They're the ones who instilled in me and my brothers and sisters the need to work for Indian people and, exhibit your compassion and caring for Indian people.
What's your greatest hope because of what you've seen in Indian country?
Well, I think the biggest hope is that American Indian and Alaska Native people will continue to be resilient and have strength. I think, we've survived all of these years, hundreds of years, and I think over the last 10 years I've seen tribes become stronger, and so I'm hoping that they will maintain their strength and courage to really overcome a lot of obstacles and continue to work on behalf of Indian rights. I think the biggest challenge to accomplishing the sovereignty, I guess, of Indian people are all of the forces that hope to diminish the tribe's authorities. Everybody knows about the recent election here in 2016. I think there's a lot of education that has taken place in the country about American Indian and Alaska Native people and their status. I think a lot of people don't know about treaty rights and about the sovereignty of tribes, and they don't respect those rights. And I think that's one of the biggest obstacles is the need to educate non-Indians about Indian people.
Generations.
I think as far as leaving a message for young people and future generations, I think that they need to remember where they came from. They need to remember the strength of their ancestors, their families, and to not give up hope, to really strive to work hard on behalf of themselves and their tribal people, to really represent Indian people at the highest levels and continue to be really strong and resilient. I think, getting back to my native language, I wasn't taught fluently how to speak my language because my mom, who speaks both Bannock and Shoshone, she said that she wasn't really willing to teach us because we would probably not succeed in school if we learned our language, that we had to maintain the English language, and which was, probably not the best decision back then, but because now she's teaching younger people the Bannock language at home, and I know a few words, but I don't know how to speak fluently in my language. I think the only, what I would like to say to young Indian people and to others that are maybe struggling with their identity or with their goals for the future is to really remember again where you came from, remember that we really need young people to work on behalf of Indian people at all levels, at the local, regional, national level. And I'd really like to see more Native people in Washington, D.C., because Indian people are not willing to go to D.C., but we really need American Indian and Alaska Native people in offices in Washington. So I'd like to see more people there.